exposición estará a cargo del Dr. Hugh Griffiths, investigador del British Antarctic Survey, ganador de la medalla SCAR del Comité Científico de Investigación Antártica. Él fue uno de los principales conferencistas del 9º Congreso Chileno de Investigaciones Antárticas, realizado el año antepasado en Olmué, donde llamó la atención sobre las conexiones y teleconexiones de la Antártica con los mares y continentes que la rodean y su impacto en la biodiversidad polar. Dr. Hugh Griffiths, le damos la palabra. Muchas gracias por estar aquí.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for having me. It's a real honor to be invited to give a talk at this Congress, and I'm just sharing my screen so that hopefully you can see a picture of Antarctica. And Antarctica, you might think it's strange that you have a British person talking at a Chilean conference, but Antarctica is a truly international place. And Chile is the closest country to Antarctica. And I've been lucky enough to travel through Chile many times and work with lots of Chilean colleagues on Antarctic science, including my work with SCAR, the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, who kindly gave me my medal recently. So it's a real pleasure to be here. Unfortunately, what I'm going to be talking about are issues that are affecting Antarctica in a very negative way, with changes that are happening from all over the world. So very often we think of Antarctica as being at the bottom of the world. So people tend to forget it exists. But actually Antarctica for the oceans is in the middle of the world, and it is where most of the world's oceans join up. So what happens in Antarctica affects the rest of the world, and what we do in the rest of the world affects Antarctica. So there are many threats and changes happening within Antarctica today. And if you lived in Antarctica, the things you would see changing would be the weather, the temperature. You would see the oceans are becoming more acidic. We have plastic and pollution coming into Antarctica. We have industrial scale fishing, so commercial exploitation of the animals that live in Antarctica. We have animals that don't belong in Antarctica that are starting to come in. And we have human beings visiting Antarctica on a scale that has never happened before. So we have more people and more effects from the outside world affecting Antarctica every day. So one of the big uncertainties is how much each of these things individually affects Antarctica, but also how much when they combine, does it make things worse for the animals and plants that live in Antarctica? So I'm starting with this very simple video of Antarctica surrounded by sea ice. So you can see the edge of the ice here is moving, and this is the continent in the middle. And this is from the year 2016 into 2017 during the summer when the ice was melting and it got to its lowest level ever. And this is for all human records of ice in Antarctica got to the lowest point it's ever reached. And this is important to know because up until a few years ago, the ice around Antarctica was expanding and getting bigger. And ice is incredibly important for deciding what can and cannot live in Antarctica and the way it lives there. From the animals on land and the plants on land through to the animals and plants in the sea. And that includes the things we know, like the penguins and things, but also down to the things that people catch, like fish and thousands of other types of animals. So I'm going to go through that in this talk. But ice in itself is very important, and it is changing. We have ice on the land, on the left-hand side, which is covering the entire continent. If you imagine that only less than 1% of Antarctica has no ice on it. So if you wanted to find rocks or plants, the only place you can find it is less than 1%. Then this ice on the land, which is years and thousands of years of snow building up on the continent, also spills out into the sea. and becomes these giant floating ice shelves around the edge, which is the middle picture here. And some of these can be over 1 kilometer thick. And when they break up, they produce the giant icebergs that we've been talking about. And what's interesting is that if you look at the top end of the Antarctic Peninsula, there used to be 2 other ice shelves when I was a child here. And since in my lifetime, 2 ice shelves have completely collapsed and big icebergs are breaking off the next one. So we need to be concerned. And then the other thing I showed you in the video before was the sea ice. And sea ice comes in many different types. It can be very old and very thick. It can be brand new. It can be in small pieces. It can stretch for hundreds of miles. And it is a source of food for a lot of animals because there's lots of plants living in the sea ice. It's a nursery for things like krill. It's incredibly important for all the animals living in the Antarctic. And speaking of animals, most people think of these kind of creatures as the animals you have in Antarctica. So we have Juliana coming up later with an entire talk about penguins. So I won't cover penguins too much, but these are pictures that I took in 2019 on a German vessel in the Weddell Sea, which is a beautiful part of the Antarctic, and the wildlife has never really seen human beings before. So these are the things that breathe air and live on the ice. So we're used to seeing these as the images of Antarctica. And they are beautiful animals, but they're not the only thing that live there. So there are around 90 species of these seals and penguins and birds living in Antarctica. And I've drawn this circle very small because there are a lot less of them than there are species living in the water. So plankton and fish and jellyfish and other groups are floating around in the water. And that seems like 700 species seems like quite a lot of species. But if you look to where I work at the bottom of the sea, there are thousands and thousands of species. So the most recent estimate is close to 20,000 species of animals from lots and lots of different groups living at the bottom of the sea in Antarctica. And the way they look today is more like the rest of the world used to look when the dinosaurs were alive. So we don't have sharks, we don't have many big crushing predators like the normal crabs that you would find in warmer water. We don't have lobsters, and it's generally a very rich environment, and it's full of life. And it's one of the highest biomasses of life anywhere in the world. And it's also very dependent on the sea ice. And every time we go to Antarctica and we look at the life at the bottom of the sea, about 10 to 20% of the animals that we collect are brand new to science. So the world is warming, and the polar regions are warming faster than most of the rest of the world. And currently we have a cold environment dominated by ice. And on the left-hand side, you can see what that world looks like. We have krill, which are small crustaceans, which are eaten by penguins and whales and seals. And they feed a food chain of giants, like the blue whale, the biggest animal to have ever lived. And we also have large penguins, and we have penguins that only nest in Antarctica. But as the world warms, evidence shows that we might shift to one that is dominated by things called salps, which are a small gelatinous, so made of jelly, and they're a bit like a jellyfish, but also we'd be moving towards jellyfish as well. And these animals are not food for the animals we're talking about that live in Antarctica today. And also, as the waters warm, different types of penguins, for example, are already living on the subantarctic islands, which could come in and start to change the way Antarctica works and compete with the emperor penguins and the Adelie penguins. And on land, you might think of Antarctica as a land of giants, like I talked about with the whales, but on land, it's a land of microscopic animals. We have less than 1% of the area of Antarctica is ice-free, so there isn't much space for big animals, and there aren't many plants. So the biggest animals we have are tiny microscopic mites, insects with no wings, springtails, and water bears. Now they survive incredibly well in the cold. You can even freeze them and defrost them, and they will come back to life. So they are specialists in Antarctica. But as Antarctica warms and as it gets greener and as it gets more ice-free areas, soon we'll be looking more like the areas you find on the subantarctic islands. And this is a big concern because most people think that more biodiversity is a good thing. But in the case of Antarctic terrestrial systems on land, more biodiversity means that these small animals could easily be wiped out by bigger competitors that can't cope with the cold at the moment. And around the coasts of West Antarctica, on this side here, it is becoming warmer and wetter, which means it is also now becoming more hospitable for plants to grow. So we have it getting greener in the West Antarctic. And the same forces that are driving it to get warmer and wetter in the west are making it drier and colder in the east. And this is meaning that the plants in the East Antarctic are shrinking and dying, meaning the habitats are changing a lot. So the west could end up with lots of animals and plants living there that have never lived there before. And the east could end up losing a lot of the species that it already has. So it's a big concern and something that we are monitoring. And in the oceans, we have even more concerns than just temperature changing. Because if you imagine the fizzy soda, the cans of drink that contain carbon dioxide, if you had two of those and one was warm and one was cold, the warm one would lose all of its gas faster than the cold one, because physics tells us that cold liquids can hold more gas than warm ones. So it means when the oceans are absorbing carbon dioxide, the cold oceans of the Arctic and Antarctic are absorbing more of the carbon dioxide than the tropics. And this carbon dioxide is changing the pH. It's making the oceans more acidic. And for many animals, this is a problem. For some of these animals here, like the mollusks and the echinoderms and the bryozoans and the corals, they make their skeletons, so their bodies are made from calcium carbonate. And it's much harder to absorb calcium carbonate from the water and to create a skeleton if the water is acidic. So we are now trying to find out how badly these animals will be affected. And perhaps an even more worrying sign is that krill, that important animal in the Antarctic food chain, is actually suffering when you change the pH and is less likely to be able to reproduce. So this is another concern. We also have people traveling to Antarctica. And although the tourism is very well managed and people are incredibly well behaved in Antarctica, the animals could still be stressed. We have a graph here on the right that shows a decline in penguin breeding success and numbers of individuals at the most busy tourist site in Antarctica at the end of the Antarctic Peninsula. So even when tourism is well managed, we should not get complacent, and we need to keep checking that we're not doing any harm to these animals. We also have accidental introductions of animals to Antarctica. In the sea, these are relatively new. So for the first time, we have found mollusks that are not usually found in Antarctica living there. We have concerns about crabs that may be able to come in as the water warms. And on land, we have established populations of insects, non-native plants, even some grasses. And what might surprise you is the damage that animals who don't belong there can do. On Macquarie Island, rabbits had to be exterminated because they got in and were digging up the foundations of the island, and the whole island was starting to fall apart because of the damage that rabbits did. And on other subantarctic islands, simple mice that would do no harm in the proper place don't have their usual food. So instead, they started killing and eating the chicks of albatrosses. So the baby albatrosses were being eaten alive by hundreds of mice. So these kind of introductions of animals, we don't know what the consequences are from introducing strange animals to a landscape that has never seen them before. And another huge human impact is the impact of plastics and pollution. We're only just starting to understand how many birds are suffering from fishing gear, how many seals have drowned in nets, and then we don't understand what is happening with the microplastics in the system. But we do know that some areas of Antarctica have similar levels of microplastics to parts of the United States of America, which is really shocking given that there are only a few thousand people in Antarctica living at any one time. And you could be comparing that to cities with millions of people. So the pollution is getting in from outside of Antarctica as well. And we mustn't forget our history. Fishing in Antarctica today is incredibly well managed. And it's got very strict rules and it's internationally run. But the long-term effects of exploitation of seals for their skin and whales for their blubber and meat has led to a complete change in some parts of the ecosystem, which could take hundreds of years to recover. So thankfully, we've seen the seals recover, but possibly too quickly. So now there are millions. And without the whales there to compete for food, the balance is wrong in the ecosystem. And I'd like to finish there and say thank you very much again for inviting me to talk. And I look forward to the discussion later. Thank you very much.